right. Hey, welcome back to part 2 of my interview with Kevin. If you guys remember from last time, Kevin is a friend of mine from the Tilbury, Chatham area. I don't know. Do you say Chatham Kent? I thought you were in Tilbury. Is that Chatham Kent? Isn't that Leamington?
Being a rural church out in the country, our mailing address is Coatsworth. The physical address, the sign says Stevenson. The closest big town is Tilbury, and it's part of the county of Chatham-Kent. So it's a bit confusing. I like to tell people it's like
Does it really exist?
On the Pirates of the Caribbean. You know, it's one of those. There's this treasure island, and you can't get there unless you've already been there. It's kind of like our church. That once you find us, people just love to come back. But sometimes when people want to come for the first time, they can't quite make it out because it's a bit hard to find. Some days.
So we were talking about a book you recently wrote that I keep calling the wrong thing.
Faithful in Small Things.
I think you titled it wrong. It should have been Faithful in the Small Things. I'm just saying, like, from a non-writer,
You can talk to my publisher about that.
Faithful in Small Things. So, and the reason we were talking about it was not just because you published a book, which is pretty cool in itself. It was the topic of the book that is so fascinating to me. And so one of the things we were supposed to talk about week 1 that we didn't, the question of what kind of sets your book apart. So anybody who's listening going, poverty, well, yeah, there's endless voices speaking into this. Yeah. What is it that inspired you to write a book about a topic that seemingly has already too many voices in it?
Yeah, well, see, there's like this. Well, our world is increasingly polarized, right? And so there's one camp that's all about social justice issues, right? And they're that's like their thing, and they sometimes we call them social justice warriors or whatever, and that's all they want to talk about. And then there's this other side that says, wait, but what about Jesus? Shouldn't we bring Jesus into the picture? And then they are reacting to some of the problems in this kind of social. Some people call it the social gospel or social justice gospel or whatever. And then they react to that and say, well, we can't get Jesus out of the mix. And then they sometimes go a little bit too far and they say, well, let's not help the poor as much. But I think one of the things I'm trying to do with this book is like, we don't have to be divided on this. Like one of the examples that strikes me as so profound in the Bible is the Apostle Paul, right? He was persecuting Christians as a Jewish leader, and then he becomes a Christian himself in this like amazing conversion experience, and he's trying to prove himself to the apostles, and he's done this missions work already. He comes and he talks to the apostles about his theology, and they have all these discussions about what he was teaching and preaching and proclaiming, and they were agreed on all of that. And then as Paul's recounting this event where he was talking with the apostles, he says, they just encouraged me not to forget about the poor, the very thing I was also concerned with. So then it's like this little add-on to this story that the apostle said, just don't forget about the poor. And Paul says, I'm very eager to remember the poor as well. And so there was no disagreement about that either. But I think that's something we should all agree on, is that there's people in poverty in our world. There's all kinds of difficult situations going on. And we as the church should never forget about them. We should never neglect them. In fact, sometimes people will use the story where this woman comes to Jesus and she breaks perfume or opens this bottle of perfume and puts it on his feet, anoints him. And Judas is upset about this. He was the guy who took care of the money, and he said, "Oh, we could have used this to feed poor people for a long time, and she's being wasteful here." And Jesus rebukes him. Like that disciple wasn't really concerned about the poor. He was kind of corrupt himself. But Jesus says, the poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. And so we look at that and we say, well, Jesus said the poor you will always have with you, so since we can't fix it, why bother trying? And that's the exact opposite of what Jesus is getting at. Like, Jesus is quoting a verse from Deuteronomy, and while in that moment it was perfectly appropriate for her to anoint him because of what was to come, Jesus is quoting a verse in Deuteronomy, and if you go back to that verse, it talks about the poor you will always have with you, therefore you should always care for them. That it's the exact opposite. Instead of they'll always be here, so why bother trying to end it? It's, well, they'll always be here, so there should never be a time where we are not caring for them, right? And so that's it's just a really big thing that all churches everywhere should care about in some way, shape, or form. Now, we can debate about how we go about doing that.
Yep.
Of course, there's those debates, but the fact that God wants us to care for others, that should never be a part of that. That's open to debate in Christianity, that we should all agree on this. And sadly, we don't always.
Well, and that's where you kind of lost me, that Christians don't always just agree. Like, the Christians would bicker and fight. Like,
yeah, well, it's being...
I'm just kidding. It happens all the time.
Yeah.
There's so much divide. But this is one of those things where you kind of go, how in the world are we divided?
Yeah.
But I think, and so I'm watching your face as you're telling some of this, and you said something about Christians should never forget the poor. And on your face, you went back to episode 1, which I saw something go back to say, because I was once there.
Yeah.
Because this isn't, and so I think for people like me who've been lucky enough to not have to experience poverty. I think often we view poverty through a lens of, well, you live in Canada, you lazy bums, go get a job. Like, I know that sounds terrible, and that's not what I want to quote from me to say that's how I feel, but let's be honest.
That's what people think.
That is what we hear.
Yeah.
And then when that is your story, and are there people who are on the streets who want to be on the streets? 100%. I mean, there's not even denying in that. Are there people that are poor and they don't want help? Yes. But that is not the majority of the story. And that is not in any way, shape, and form the way we should be looking at it. Because even those that don't want help, do they actually not want help? Or are they in a place where they've been hurt so much that they can't even fathom the idea of getting help? Right? And so it's just interesting when I saw that look, I thought, that's one of the things that's missing in a lot of these conversations is the fact that a lot of people who are rich are trying to figure out how to deal with the poor, but they've never actually experienced it. And for you then, coming into this book, you have this perspective of growing up, having struggled, having lost a home, having dealt with this, but now on a flip side, being in a place where you're helping the poor. And I think that gives you a profound insight. It reminds me of a neat experience I had a couple of years ago. So Mennonite Central Committee used to, I don't think they do it anymore, but in Toronto, they did the street walks. And I don't remember the exact purpose. They had a street pastor, so I knew why he was there. I don't remember how we got involved. So anyways, Will, another guy from the church, and me went up and went on a street walk with them. And so it was a group of us, and basically we went and walked, and we talked to some of the homeless there, and we were chatting. And then when we came back, the part that stuck out to me so much is one of our leaders looks at me and goes, "Did you know that in our group are several homeless people?" And I thought, that's so unbelievably profound. Because usually it's the rich coming in to care for the poor, and here's these people who are struggling just as much and going, my heart is just to help other people. And that completely shifted my mindset on so much of it because, again, I was naive going into this. I grew up in Elmer, which it is a very nice place to live, a wonderful place to live, despite what the media tells you about certain things happening in Elmer sometimes that are related to certain people that are on the north end of town.
No need to be too specific. They're out.
Right, but it's a wonderful place to live. And but I didn't actually really experience a lot of this poverty. And so then a lot of the myths that I had have slowly been kind of weaned away as to how you actually deal with this. And so that's what's got me intrigued now about books like yours speaking into some of this, going, look, you have to get a new perspective. Money isn't going to solve this.
Now, I want to tell you a story about this that explains a little bit. I tell the story in the book as well. I grew up in Alberta, and our former premier, well, I like Alberta, but the former premier's name was Ralph Klein, and he was there for a very long time. A lot of Albertans really loved King Ralph. We called him King Ralph. And
he's not related to Calvin?
No, not Calvin Klein, Ralph Klein. But they loved him. He was in power for a very long time. But he was in the news, and this is a well-documented story. You can look it up on Google. Well, one day he pulls up to a homeless shelter, and he's wasted, like drunk, crazy drunk. And he throws change at the people there and tells them to get jobs, okay? So he's the most powerful man in the province, as such, quite wealthy. And he has his driver pull him to a homeless shelter to berate those that are suffering from homelessness, okay? After that, it came out that he had an alcohol problem and he started getting help for this. But the really kind of ironic thing about this is the most powerful man in the province who had a lot of wealth as well, struggled with an addiction, the same addiction that cripples the lives of so many people. There was a poverty within Premier Klein that was just as profound as the poverty in the people that he was yelling at that night. And so just because we have money does not mean there's a lack of poverty in our own lives. It just might take a bit of a different form.
Wow.
And that's one of the definitions that I bring up in the book is, and it's not my own framework either. It's a guy named Bryant Myers who writes about this, and it's they talk about it as well in books like When Helping Hurts, and a number of other books as well. It's this framework of understanding poverty as a series of broken relationships, right? And so there's Myers goes back to the Genesis story and looks at when Adam and Eve sinned. There's evidence of 4 broken relationships. The first one is a broken relationship with God. The second one is a broken relationship with one another. A third one is a broken relationship with yourself, and a fourth, a broken relationship with the environment and the world we live. And so to kind of unpack this from the Genesis story, they took the forbidden fruit, they ate it. After that, they were scared. They hid from God.
And from each other.
And from each other. But let's start with God. They hid from God, and God says, that like, where are you? Why aren't you walking with me? They could walk with God in person, which blows my mind. It's something I would love to do because I've got questions for the big guy.
Yeah.
But they hid from him because they were ashamed, because Adam says, I was ashamed because I was naked, so I hid. So there's this relational breakdown between them and God. Then they start blaming each other. God, this woman you put here with me, she took the fruit and she gave it to me, so I just had some. And Eve's like, the serpent. I'm pointing at Trevor now. Sorry, Trevor. You're not the serpent.
He's 22, so that generation is to blame for everything right now. So you're nailing it.
Blame the younger generation. No, I don't want to do that. But so Eve blames the serpent, and so there's this like breakdown in their relationships with each other. They're blaming each other, and then they're ashamed of their own bodies, that there's something within themselves, that the way they look at themselves, and they feel shame because they're not wearing any clothes, and so then there's something going on with how they view themselves, and then after that, God says you're going to have to toil the ground to scratch out a living for yourself. And so there's this brokenness between them and the world. These 4 relationships break down, and at any level, they can cause poverty. And so last time we talked about people I knew who were homeless because of a breakdown in a relationship with their parents. Right. Very, very clear. Broken relationship with them and someone else. Or we see it all the time when if there's abusive homes and a mom has to flee with her kids, then poverty happens almost immediately because of that broken relationship with another person. With yourself, there's things like mental illness is one of the clearest ones, where there's a broken relationship with yourself. But then also, if you grow up in poverty and you internalize it and you think I'm poor because of who I am, that it's something internal to yourself instead of external to you, then you might not even take advantage of the opportunities given to you because you think, well, I'm not worthy of that. I could never even do that. They're giving me this opportunity, but they don't know who I am. And so you sabotage your own life before you even get started. And that's remarkably common with people in poverty. And that's a broken relationship with themselves. And then the environment, it's,
Maybe if I can jump in 1 second with the mental health piece. I do want to add a tiny little piece, and that is to say that mental health is a big buzzword right now.
Yeah.
And there is the mental health piece where it's biological and it is something that's out of your control. But then there's a large part of it that you're talking about here where we allow, whether that is our self-hate, our self-worth, all these things to really become a mental illness in the way we view ourselves and we view our value and stuff. And so I do want to differentiate that because I know it is such a buzzword.
Yeah.
But there's a difference between the disease and allowing yourselves to think in certain patterns and processes.
Yeah, and it's going to be different for every person's situation who struggles with mental health or mental illness. But for every person, there are things within your control and there are things outside of your control, right? Those things outside of our control, we should never judge someone for those things because they're completely outside of our control. And we shouldn't, condemn them for the things within their control. But one of the hopeful pieces is there are things within our control. Every single person has certain things within our control. And that's a a beautiful thing, because if we can come to understand that and realize that not everything about it is hopeless, not everything about our lives is just happening to us, but that we actually have some power and some agency to get help in this world, to do something, to rather help ourselves or to get help. But this we got to be very, very careful with that, though, because so easy we use that kind of teaching to blame those who are victims of something. We say, well, there are these things within your control, so stop complaining about those other things, and we just dismiss them. Yep. And that I find to be a very wicked kind of thing that the church sometimes does, and we're very, it's a truth that's used to dismiss people, and that I find that then, there's a truth, but how is it functioning? How are we using that truth? We're using it to further entrench those things that have already hurt them instead of helping them up. And so the truth can be a great hope for people, but it has to be a truth that's accompanied by grace and love instead of a truth that is used to just dismiss them, right? And that's a very difficult line to walk with each person.
Sure it is. But there is something that is very specific that if we miss this in dealing with the poor, we're going to miss the opportunity to change them, and that is that we actually have to care for the person.
Yeah.
And I know for us pastors, there's a passage in 1 Corinthians that typically just gets preached at weddings. And it's this definition of love, and everybody's like, it's about a husband. But it's that whole thing where it says, if anything you do, if it doesn't come back to you loving that person, it's meaningless.
In fact, it says you could give all you have to the poor,
right,
but without love, it's worthless.
Right.
Right. So even as we talk about poverty, that kind of definition is huge, because we like to think we're helping the poor if we can write the checks to charity, the huge checks or whatever, but you can give everything you have to them. But if you don't love them, what are you doing? Like, the Bible says it's meaningless.
Well, and the reason it becomes meaningless is because we've seen this play out. Yeah. You can throw money at somebody, and you've got friends, I've got friends who have struggled. You can throw money at an addict. It's not going to cure them. It may give them opportunities, but what they actually really need is that relationship. And one of the most fascinating things, and I'm sure I've shared this story a ton of times before, but when we did a thing on trauma, and it was through Family and Children's Services, so it had nothing to do church-wise. And so she came in, she was talking about trauma, and she just said, she was showing the difference in the brain, how it develops when they're traumatized versus when it's not. And so crazy stuff. Crazy the way that all... But then her response was that no matter what you put this kid in, if they do not have at least one person who loves and believes in them, nothing can change. There is no medicine for this. There is no magic cure. They have to be loved. And if a person can actually be loved, they're saying there's scientific evidence that says it can actually help heal the brain, which is crazy. But that, again, is that framework of, it's not just, often people say, well, without love, it's meaningless. But no, you got to play that out. Without love, you're literally just throwing money at things and not actually helping people get out whatsoever. And I think that's where I think we fall short. We wouldn't want to say this, that we don't love the poor, but to love the poor requires a lot of time. To love those who are hurting requires a lot of energy and effort. And if we're just to be completely honest, so often we would just rather not. And it would be easier just to write that check so I can go on doing what I want to do.
Yeah, and then writing checks becomes a way we pat ourselves on the back and kind of release ourselves from responsibility. And there's this helpful thing that we talk about in parenting, and you probably teach the same thing as what we teach in this, is that children spell love T-I-M-E, time. And the same holds true for all relationships. If you're going to have a relationship with someone, it takes time.
Some of that is because our education system is struggling, so they can't actually spell it properly. But some of it works out. So.
might be a part of it there.
Online learning here. Just kidding.
But those
whole different topics. Sorry.
Those relationship pieces are just so key. And like, this is something that I studied quite a bit in university. It just grabbed my attention. So I took some classes about children and violence, and the statistics are that it's just having one adult person for a kid that's in trauma. Like you said, it takes one person, and so they have this list of effects that the trauma will bring. A huge list. Like, it's mind-boggling how much it devastates a person for the rest of their lives to have a few years of trauma in childhood. But you have one person that loves them unconditionally and believes in them, just one. and it buffers those effects so that they're not nearly as severe. And that is huge. The statistics are staggering. And so when you think about that can you be a friend to one kid? Just one kid? And so there's programs like the Big Brother and Big Sister program, and that's what they seek to do, is to help these kids that need that adult role model. And those relationships, they take time, but it's transformative for people. And so there's this huge piece where the relationship component is amazing. Now there's a study, you may have heard of it. In terms of addictions, we often think about it as like chemical hooks, right? Like you get addicted to a substance and it's a physiological thing. But they're finding that that's only part of the story. People started asking questions after they sent these troops overseas. I think it was Vietnam, and they gave them heroin or something overseas to deal with the trauma of war. And when they came back, not everyone was addicted. And the science of the day would have said, if you give them these drugs, then they're going to get addicted to it, and then they come back and they want it. Well, some of them did, but not nearly all of them. And started asking, well, why? And so these kinds of questions led to these experiments. The typical one we think of, you put a rat in a cage, you give them normal water and water laced with drugs. They'll choose the drugs one right away, and then it eventually leads to overdose, and the rat dies. But someone looked at that experiment and said, okay, but you're taking a rat out of its natural habitat. You're taking it away from the way of life that it has. So they did another experiment where they called it Rat Park. They made like a rat heaven or whatever, like a great home for rats. They put them together with other
rat
rats.
Heaven. That's good. I like it.
They called it the Rat Park experiment. So they had these like tunnels for them to crawl through or whatever. Like they made it amazing, an amazing life from a rat standpoint. Yeah. And then they put the water there, that was normal water, and the water laced with heroin. The overdose went from 100% to virtually non-existent.
Really?
Because the rats had other rats. And it began asking questions. People began asking questions about this then, about like, well, then there must be a relationship piece, because otherwise you isolate them in a cage, you put them in jail, right? As opposed to having, and so then their only option to pass the time and to deal with this, trauma of being alone was the drugs. But when they had other rats, they had stuff to do, it was a great life for them. They didn't need the drugs, and they would leave it alone. It wasn't what they wanted. And that, I think, gives tremendous hope for the church. As well, this whole idea of talking about poverty is a series of broken relationships, because we as the church are called ministers of reconciliation. Anyone who's a follower of Jesus is considered a minister of reconciliation. And reconciliation is about fixing these relationships, first of all with God, and then with one another, with ourselves, with our broken world. And so then there's tremendous hope for addictions, for all kinds of things in Jesus, in the healing of broken relationships, because that's what God actually empowers us to do. It takes time, yeah, but then that also reveals another complication, because if we think about poverty like that, it's no longer about, okay, like how our government would view it. How can we get everyone to have this much money? We have our poverty line. Right. We need to have this much money, and then we're no longer in poverty. But like I talked about earlier with Ralph Klein, there was a poverty in him that was just as deep as the homeless people, even though it didn't lead to physical poverty. Right. And so then the question becomes, what would it take to heal all of the broken relationships in your life? What would it take to heal the relationship between you and the people that you're no longer friends with, or your parents or your siblings? What would it take to heal the relationship between you and yourself, to be able to view yourself in a way that is healthy, the way the Bible wants us to view ourselves, with sober judgment, yes, not being arrogant or proud or whatever, but also being viewed as valuable and not worthless. What would it take for you to think of yourself as valuable? And what would it take for you to live in harmony with creation, in the world we live in, that's not further destroying the world? And when we ask questions like that, and we think, okay, if that's poverty, then there's both a tremendous weightiness to it, because it becomes clear it's not an easy solution. It's not a quick and simple fix. And that's what we want with poverty. Oh, there's poverty. We want a quick and simple fix. We want a silver bullet. People sometimes ask me, what have you learned that can help us fix it? I don't want something wishy-washy. But it's just complicated and messy. Yeah. And so it sounds wishy-washy. Heal broken relationships. But yet that's it shows how complicated that is, but also it shows the tremendous hope that we have because of the way many of us who follow Jesus have seen him restore relationships that we thought were dead.
Yep. Yeah.
With us and God, with us and one another, with us and ourselves. Like, there's tremendous power in the cross to do that. Right. And that's just a beautiful thing, but it's also a weighty thing.
Right. And so I think, so from a practical standpoint, I don't think we're saying it's get rid of all the big organizations doing stuff. I think it's about taking agency and going, but you also need to care for the poverty that you're dealing with and the poverty in those that you've been surrounded with. And if we could even just get everyone to focus on just restoring their relationships with their family, if we could even just go that small, it would have a tremendous generational impact in our country. When you think about, again, the kids coming to live at your place, when you think about the amount of broken families, and that's, when I say broken families, that's not necessarily just divorced. You can have broken families that are all living together in one home and fully married. So I'm talking about that in the sense of either a healthy, in a good place family versus one that's really broken.
And I think actually when we serve others, it's best if we recognize the brokenness in ourselves. Absolutely. Too. Because so often when we try to help with poverty, we're like, okay, well, I'm part of North America. I've got more money than the rest of the world. We talked about the marred identity complex of the poor. Well, the flip side of that is the God complex of the rich. We internalize our wealth and we think, well, I've got wealth, I've got the answers. And a piece of it makes sense. If I wanted to learn to be a mechanic, I'd go and be like a mechanic. So if you think of poverty in terms of money, you think, well, we need to think about how do we be rich like the rich people. But so often there's rich people that got rich by being immoral, and not always. There's a lot of wealthy people that are very, very honest, but it happens. And so it's
some of them were just born into it. Yeah. You didn't have to do anything for it. It just,
exactly.
And I would argue that's how my story is. My parents brought me to this country that gave me every opportunity, and I was surrounded by loving people, and I didn't, that story is not normal for a lot of people. And so I think it's more about using what you have and using your story and the resources you have to help others around you. And again, that goes back to the parish model of going, okay, who are the people around you? Let's take care of those. But at the same time, recognize there are some very difficult, harder cases, some extreme cases that you need professionals for. Yeah. It isn't as simple as to say, okay, we don't need Salvation Army. We don't need all these homelessness initiatives. We still need all those.
Oh, yeah.
But we would need them less if we would also take care of those on our block. Yeah.
Well, I was told about a story in Kitchener, and they started this homelessness or housing initiative to help tackle homelessness. And so they get people housing and a job. And so then these people went from living on the street to having a job and a house, but they'd come home to this empty apartment or house, and they had 4 walls and a roof. They had food, but they were so lonely that they started to see them go back to the streets because they didn't have any friends in their home. And so at least on the streets, they had each other. So they started to see this repeat cycle. So they approached Mennonite Central Committee and asked them if they could help. So they developed this program they called Circle of Friends. And all it did was They paired people with some of these people in this program just to be friends. That was it. And the rates of people going back to the street just dropped because they had friends. It was that relationship piece. It doesn't mean you don't need the money piece. It doesn't mean you don't need the generosity, or they didn't need the housing program. They needed that too, but they also needed friends. Yeah. And if we take that one step further, I think we also need God. And that's something in my book that I'm very strong about is the need for Jesus in our lives as we do this work. And so then as we approach people, we also remember, okay, these people need friends, but maybe I didn't experience poverty in the same way that they did, but there's also something broken about me, and we can meet on a level not as I'm rich and you're poor, I'm high and you're low, but we can meet on this level of we have all experienced brokenness. And when you approach it like a friendship, you're approaching it with this attitude of I can learn from this person. They are valuable. They have something to offer. And not that we're just there to take from them, but that they are valuable to this world, and we can love them and walk with them together as friends, not just as this kind of weird, I'm rich, you're poor, I'm the one that's going to save you from yourself, and you're the one that's going to receive it. Like, no, that messes it up.
Okay, we are completely out of time. Make sure you guys check the book, Faithful in Small Things. Thank you, Kevin. It has been awesome. We'll see you again soon.